Hey Internet, so a lot of people, including myself, have been using the term midwit a lot in various philosophical and political takes, and I've noticed that a lot of people seem to take the word midwit the wrong way. And to be honest, I can't really blame them, because I think a lot of people use this word the wrong way. People often use midwit as kind of a generic insult to kind of dumpster on the average Joe, and that's, well, very, very wrong. There's nothing wrong at all with having an average intellectual ability. In fact, many people with what you would say are in the average zone, the IQ curve, are very successful people with many valuable qualities that those with higher IQ do not have. G is important, but it's definitely not everything. So what is the difference then between a midwit and the average Joe? Well, I'll give a simple definition at the end of the video, as well as a special announcement, but it won't make any sense unless I first tell a little story about two people. Just to keep things a little entertaining, I will call this the tale of the Chad average Joe and Carl the virgin midwit. The first part of this story starts out with the birth of Chad. Born towards the end of the Dust Bowl, Chad didn't exactly have an easy life. He had to help his parents with various chores on the farm, but rather than complain about it, he just sort of did it. And this pattern of just sort of rolling with the punches continued throughout most of his life. In school, Chad found himself in a fairly straightforward situation. Did okay with courses like history after struggling a bit with reading and math, and from all this, Chad learned one of the most important lessons a man can learn in his entire life. He figured out that he was a pretty average guy. In other words, Chad simply accepted himself for what he was. He knew he wasn't a genius, and he wasn't anything special, and from this humility came a huge strength. The power of realistic expectations. It seems obvious at first glance, but sadly an absolutely insane number of people never learn this lesson. They spend their entire lives completely unaware of where they are in terms of ability, and end up wasting and missing various opportunities that would be a great fit for them if they just knew that they were good opportunities for them. So with this power, Chad decided to become a mechanic. He married his high school sweetheart, had 4 children together, bought a house with a few acres of land, and lived a fairly straightforward middle-class life with many adventures and ups and downs in between. Because he was a mechanic, he was able to get a used motorhome for cheap that he was able to easily maintain and take his family on road trips throughout the western United States on a fairly regular basis. But all the good things do come to an end, and just before the time that the pandemic started, Chad found himself coming down with cancer and passed away surrounded by his grandchildren and even some great-grandchildren. But it really wasn't that sad. I mean, Chad knew that his time was up, and he knew that he had a good life, and he had done everything and gotten everything in life he could have hoped for. So, was it really that bad? Looking back on his life, Chad realized just how important the realization that he was just an average Joe was. It allowed him to set realistic, tangible goals for himself, and he was able to achieve each and every one of those goals. And in the end, that's pretty darn successful. Far better than the man who seemingly gets much further in life, but then falls short of getting what he really wants out of it. Which then brings me to Carl, the virgin midwit. Carl was born in the Silicon Valley area of California to extremely rich parents and grew up at around the time of the tech boom. He was handed everything he ever wanted and got to go to a school surrounded by upper middle class and rich kids like himself. Carl was also relatively bright, getting mostly A's in every class except for math. From this, Carl made the classic screw up. He assumed that getting relatively good grades in a rich school meant that he must be a genius. And this is very wrong. Getting good grades is a sign of above average intellect, but it isn't exactly difficult and isn't as G-loaded as people think it is. You see, the main flaw of the Western K-12 education system is that it is largely based on the Prussian model, or Germany in the early 1800s. And while this model is effective at teaching kids the basic of math, reading, writing, etc., it has a critical flaw, which is that it is designed primarily to reward obedience to authority more so than it is designed to reward high general intelligence. This emphasis on subservience is intentional, and was adopted as the main system for compulsory education just for this reason, to reduce the problem of people thinking for themselves. That it also happens to teach the basics is really just a bonus on top of this primary objective. And this creates an issue for abnormally intelligent students who both learn at much faster pace than normal and learn better as autodidacts. This system holds them back often more than it actually teaches them anything, so a lot of times very exceptionally abnormally intelligent kids will end up looking elsewhere to get a truly good education. It forces them to effectively diverge from the norm. So geniuses who do possess a general intelligence that is 2 or more standard deviations above normal will usually get good grades, as the correlation is definitely there, but it is absolutely not the most accurate correlation. And so concluding that good grades at a top school equals genius is close, but no cigar. Midwits, of course, are just smart enough to be very successful in the Prussian model, but not quite smart enough to see its flaws. Anyways, under the delusion of his genius, Karl decided to get into politics at a very young age. Karl looked at what others like himself were getting into. That's right, leftist progressivism, of course. And Karl really got into it. After all, Karl could clearly see that standing up for equality and economic justice was the right thing to do since, hey, most everyone else was doing it, so therefore there must be some validity to this ideology, right? So Karl really gets into it, hosting get-togethers while his parents are out of town and spending all his allowance money on tons of weed, of course, because you know that's how you really stick it to the man. And eventually Karl made it into college, got into even harder drugs, and eventually ended up dropping out as a result of dependency. Not that the liberal arts degree would have helped him much. Karl then concluded that he was a victim of the system, that this was all clearly capitalism's fault. Capitalism failed a bright young man such as himself, therefore free trade bad. And now Karl can be seen on his Facebook to this very day ranting and raving about taking out the heteronormative patriarchy and how if we just do socialism, it will all work out, and also Orange Man very bad. He now currently works part-time at Starbucks while continuing to live with his rich parents. So he still gets to live a lifestyle of a very rich kid, but he never achieved what he wanted. Unlike Chad, Karl never truly came to the realization that he wasn't actually that clever, and despite being slightly smarter than Chad, ended up in a much worse situation in life that is, ironically, far below what he could have achieved had he learned the same important, humbling lesson that Chad had learned early in his life. Had Karl realized that his struggles with mathematical reasoning meant that he wasn't actually that amazing, he could have avoided politics and instead attempted to find a career path in something that he could actually do, and been much more successful in life as a result. Probably would have done even better than Chad, to be perfectly honest. And that's pretty much the story. Examining the life of Chad and Karl, we can clearly see the difference between Chad, Average Joes, and Karl Midwits. A Midwit is basically a person who possesses average to usually slightly above average intelligence, often around one standard deviation above normal, who confuses conformity with an even higher intellectual ability. And that's pretty much their main screw up there, is the conformity element. Midwits are usually just smart enough to know they are missing out on something on an intellectual level, but Midwits don't want to accept that they are not really that clever. So to compensate, the Midwit will figure out what is considered the correct opinions trademark to hold within society. And they will then find out what the academic consensus is on any given subject, and they will adopt the views and beliefs of that consensus. In other words, a Midwit is a pseudo-intellectual who must hide their pseudo-intellectualism behind this veil of conformity. And it's a very effective veil indeed, because most of the time at least, they will be right. Academic consensus is sometimes wrong, but usually it is correct. It's really only a problem when you reach subjects and topics that have been heavily politicized. For instance, the consensus on how a rotary engine works is almost certainly correct, while the consensus of a highly politicized sociology topic, such as why something may disproportionately benefit one group over another, has a much higher chance of being incorrect since it deals with more touchy subjects that are more prone to faulty moralistic reasoning. However, to the Midwit, both of these are often seen as the same thing, and that is their main issue. This consensus worship is what leads the Midwits to make some fairly predictable reasoning mistakes that ordinarily an average person should be able to see through. The most common of these is that Midwits have a tendency to try and unironically argue that appeals to authority are valid arguments as long as the source is reliable. The truth, of course, is that an appeal to authority might be right, but not because the authority says so, but because of the data and facts and information that the authority used to reach their conclusion, not just because of their position as an expert. So when a person tries to appeal to said authority in argument, but does not actually understand said data or facts, they aren't really adding to that discussion. A related fallacy is to demand sources for arguments that are based on reason. Like you might have gotten into discussion and a Midwit might come up and say, oh, source? I need a source? I need a reliable source? Someone may say something that is based on a more or less intuitive observation of the universe, and if the Midwit doesn't agree with that observation, they will then demand a source or evidence for the claim instead of engaging with said intuition with reasoning of their own. They will also consider the source valid based on how closely aligned it is to the rest of the media establishment, hence the little thing of reliable source trademark at the end there. Another big one is that Midwits think of morality in terms of democracy. Whatever the majority says is good, well, that must mean it's good. Also sometimes referred to as conventional morality, or as opposed to principled morality. So they end up adopting a morally consequentialist mindset where whatever belief gains them the largest amount of prestige within the cathedral must therefore be the most ethically correct position to have. So they adopt these sort of moral ideologies based entirely around on how good they look to the rest of society. This is why Midwits are by far the most likely type of person to engage in virtue signaling. Their goal is to show that their loyalty is always aligned with whatever is the established ethical norm, and thus increase their prestige and rank within this society. This is also why Midwits are significantly more likely to be basically leftist woketoids. This doesn't necessarily mean that all Midwits are woketoids. I mean, there definitely are conservative and right-leaning. There are Midwits in every single ideology, but Midwits are by far most likely to be woketoids, just in the current clown world we live in, for this reason. But probably the most annoying of all is the Midwit tendency to engage in semantics and pedantry. Midwits seem to think that if they can nitpick issues on how a word has been used or defined, then this somehow refutes the cardinal truth behind what has been said. For instance, one of the responses I got to my video on social constructs was a nitpick over the fact that I did not use the academic definition of social construct. Well, yeah, of course I didn't. The point of my videos is to simplify very complex topics and arguments to make them easily digestible in roughly 6 minutes. So of course I had to use a simplified definition in order to show the problem that leftists ignore the issues of time preferences in their determination of whether or not a social construct is beneficial to society. And of course, in true Midwit fashion, this particular response did not respond or say anything in regards to time preferences, thus proving my point that they ignore time preferences. Good job, Midwit. Good job. And this happens a lot. If I had a penny for every time a Midwit tried to get around a problem by whining about definitions or attempting to redefine contradictions away while completely missing the point, well, I'm sure you get the joke by now. Anyways, all of these fallacies are centered around the same thing. They are the result of the fact that Midwits are just intelligent enough to understand what is expected of them, but they don't quite have the mental strength to question the established order. And this is where the Midwit meme comes from, because a lot of the time dimwits will absolutely rely entirely on their instincts and question the consensus of any given topic. And they usually do it in not very well thought out ways, but in a twist of irony, they often come out coming closer to the truth than Midwits, who technically are intellectually superior to them. A really good example is Wikipedia. A dimwit will find something on Wikipedia in regards to politics that they do not agree with, and conclude from this that Wikipedia must be biased. A midwit will argue that Wikipedia is a great source of information because articles on it are all based on a compilation of reliable mainstream sources. And while a more intelligent person will actually look into the rationale that Wikipedia uses to decide what is and what is not considered a reliable source, find serious flaws such as the fact that secondary sources are often given greater weight than primary evidence, and conclude from this that Wikipedia is biased. In response, Midwits will then attempt to deconstruct the more dim-witted and simplified version of the argument as a way to reconfirm their conformist beliefs, completely missing the bigger picture in the process. And this is effectively the eternal tragedy of the Midwit. Their worship of credentials and the constant need to please leads them to fall for propaganda that would ordinarily be painfully obvious. Anyways, that's pretty much the end of the Midwit section of this video, so now for that announcement. I recently appeared on the podcast of Morgan Meets the Eye in regards to right-libertarian concepts and Austrian economics, so if you're interested in some like ANCAP theory and spurging, you can be sure to give that a watch. It's a pretty good thing to listen to, perhaps when you're just working out or whatever, and that's pretty much it. So thanks for watching, and be sure to check out Morgan Meets the Eye. But for now, that is all, so if you liked the video, feel free to like, subscribe, and till next time.